Thank you so much, Sonia. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this session. If you're curious about the future, you are not alone. So I'm really happy to share with you a little bit about Foresight. So preparing for the future, leveraging Foresight inside of a business and inside of strategic planning. So I'll share with you a little bit about what it is, why it's incredibly valuable, how you implement it, so a little bit of the process and the tools behind that, and then some examples of how we've been able to leverage it inside of Mars Wrigley. So I'm Joanna Lepore. As Sonia said, I'm the Global Foresight Lead for North America inside of Mars Wrigley. Mars Wrigley you will probably recognize if I tell you brands like M&M's, Snickers, Skittles. We've got all the fun treats and snacks brands that are available across the world and across all of the parts that you're dialing in from. We have been around for a very long time. The company was founded in 1911. So we've been doing this thing for a long time, but it's the first time that we've implemented a Foresight team and a dedicated Foresight function inside of the business, inside of Mars Wrigley. So one of the first things that we did when we created Foresight, was we said, Foresight is not, despite what we would like, Foresight is not about prediction. It's not about predicting the future. It's about preparation. And so we do that. We practice Foresight and we prepare for the future by firstly really intentionally observing what's happening in the world. So intentional observation. We then implement really critical thinking about what we see. And we try to make things as human as possible, knowing that human beings guide the future and have guided the past. So when we say that you can't predict the future, oftentimes, we get asked quite a lot about the pandemic and COVID-19, and could we have predicted what was to come? I mean, here's an example of where we did exactly that. We as human beings have predicted the pandemic. Back in 2008, Vaclav Smil actually wrote a book where he said, hey, a pandemic is going to happen. It's 100% guaranteed, right? So what you'll notice inside of this quote is that he's saying, we don't know how severe it's going to be. We don't know how it's going to spread or how it's going to attack, what age groups it's going to attack. So oftentimes when we say we practice Foresight, we give navigational direction for where we see things playing out, or we look at how things are starting to give us signals of where it's headed into the future. For example, a pandemic is very likely. It's the detail underneath that might be varying quite a lot. So how is it going to come to life? Who is it going to impact? And so that's why when we talk about the future and Foresight, we always say it's multiple futures. We can give you direction, but then it might come to life in lots of different ways. So one thing that we also say is that, we as human beings are naturally inclined. We have a natural desire to see the future. And we have almost like a cognitive ability to be able to do that because our brains are always looking for patterns, right? We see faces and things that don't have faces. We look for those things that give us a sense of familiarity to be able to say, how can I prepare for this? How do I survive through this situation? So we're always constantly thinking about the future, but we actually struggle to do that very well because we have all of these cognitive biases. So we usually imagine what's going to happen based on what we've personally experienced. So our own personal memories, experiences, what we hold to be true. And generally what we hold to be true are things that we have personally lived through, or things that are really simple for our mind to imagine. So when it comes to the future, it's not always very easy for us to practice this skill, and we constantly have to catch our cognitive bias, and we in Foresight constantly have to do this. What makes predicting the future even harder is that then we say, well, actually, we can't even use the past. So Foresight is not forecasting. We don't use historical numbers to average out and project out into the future. We know that is not a great indicator of what's to happen. In fact, if we know anything about the past, is that we don't learn lessons from the past. We use the past and we use history as context for why we are where we are and what it might tell us about what's going to happen, but it's certainly not something that we can just extrapolate out. We also know that people are unpredictable. So sometimes they'll say one thing, they'll do something else, even if they really want to do what they said that they wanted to do. So we can't always rely on, really, again, extrapolating out their behavior. And, disruption is a constant, and COVID-19, supply chain challenges, cost of living, inflation, all of these are really great examples of where sometimes external forces come in, clash together, and then create a situation that's quite disruptive. And this tends to happen constantly. And so what Foresight allows you to do is to spot the signals of change. So it allows you to be really, like I said at the start, really intentionally observant about what you're seeing so that you can start to navigate towards the future. So when we say spotting the signals of change, anything and everything can be a signal. The types of new technology that's being launched can be a signal. The evolution of software on your phone, the types of clothing that people are wearing, it can be a big trend. It can be something that's really small and very much on the fringes and niche. It can be something that's very big and has been evolving over a longer period of time. What's important is that we're capturing all of that. We're really very actively and proactively looking at how all of those things are playing out in the world. And so you can imagine that what it requires is that we look across a broad spectrum of things. So one of the wonderful things about Foresight is that it leverages a number of different fields. So Foresight is a formal academic practice. It's called Futures Studies, and that is what strategic foresight inside of an organization leverages, is all of those sort of foundational skills and methodologies that are practiced in future studies. And future studies is all about sort of balancing your skills and your thinking across these areas and so many more. But it's things like sociology, really understanding human beings. And so oftentimes people will come into foresight or futurism from anthropology, psychology, sociology, the skill, the practice, the science behind humans. Science itself and science and technology, and really understanding and looking at some of the evolutions and the innovation that's taking place, analytics and economics, and really understanding how markets evolve, history and looking at the past to be able to understand the context of where we are, planning and strategy. And again, a lot of people come over from strategic functions and planning functions into foresight. I've come from marketing, which obviously leverages quite extensively planning. And then probably my favorite, which is philosophy. So you take all of that and you go, but why? Why does that exist? How could it exist differently? And therefore, foresight also means that you have to push into a little bit more creative thinking and imagination and, creating visions of the future that don't currently exist. And so you can see there then that we are looking across a number of different fields. We're paying attention to signals from science over here to what human beings are buying over here to what's happening in politics over there. So you're sort of looking across everything. But what's most important is that you're really thinking very deeply and critically about what you see. So we always say that the bedrock of foresight is deeper, more critical thinking. So you're often looking at something and saying, why does it exist this way? Or potentially, why is it being portrayed this way? And what could it mean? What is the implication of that? Who is the winner out of this situation? Who is the loser? And you're applying that critical thinking constantly to what you're observing. A great practice to do, obviously, in any profession, but particularly important inside of foresight. So how does Mars Wrigley do it? We have created a Foresight ID. So a Foresight, I guess, a model that we use to be able to scan for the signals of change and to really look across what's happening. And so it really starts with looking at the external world. So really paying attention to the macro environmental influencing forces of the world. So you might be familiar with something like a STEEP model, where you're looking across what's happening in politics through to what's happening with demographic changes, what's happening with technology. We pay very close attention to that, and that allows us to start from a very broad perspective. So really looking at those things that last for generally 10 to 30 years, those big evolutions around us. sometimes longer, obviously. And then we pull that a little bit closer into the why, the human impact. So shifts in behavior, shifts in values, shifts in societal norms, what people really care about, how they act, how they connect to one another. That's a really critical part of the process. And then we pull it even closer into the category. So for us, we always talk about treats and snacks and really paying attention to obviously how that's starting to play out or how it could play out inside of our category in terms of what we could create in innovation, right through to who we partner with and how we communicate to our consumers. So we look across those three areas. And the way that we then implement some of what we see is by going through these three phases of futures thinking. So the first phase is really explorative. So again, we're going back to those signals of change. We're really spotting as much as we can and pulling that into something that gives us a bit of a parameter. It contains our thinking a little bit. So what you see there is the futures wheel, which allows us to put anything on the outer of that. So sometimes you might put macro forces, you could put your category consumption moments, and then you're pulling in the signals of change and you're really exploring how they play out across those different areas. So the key thing here is that you're going relatively broad with exploration, but then you're starting to pull it into something that's quite concise. Making sense of it and finding the weaker signals, finding the stronger signals. You then move into the second phase where you're sense making. So you're really starting to sort of think about, how are these things implying how the future might play out. So here, what you've got pictured is a pattern map as an example of how you could do that. So almost like a detective with your piece of string. You say this over here might be connected to this over here, or these actually are very contradictory things that might clash, or here are wildcards that we see popping out of nowhere that we should be paying attention to. And then once we make sense of it, we then move into that third phase, which is projecting out into the future. And this is where you might use something like the cone of plausibility or the cone of uncertainty, which is where you start to define what that future might look like for your company and you project that out. So you might say, this is more likely today, this is more likely in the longer term future. And so what we find incredibly important is to be able to put foresight into action by practicing those key things. So really intentionally observing what we see, making it really human and anchoring it into the human being and their motivations and why they do what they do. And then really clearly defining possible futures. So when we say that we are practicing foresight inside of an organization, it's really important for that to reflect the needs and the strategies of what that organization is intending to do and intending to be. So you would never, for example, practice just an academic form of foresight inside of a CPG and just present macro forces of change. You need to make it very incredibly relevant, not just for the category, but make it relevant to what the business is trying to achieve. So I have 3 examples of how we've done that inside of the Mars Wrigley organization. In the shorter term future, one example is where we have made an investment inside of next generation intelligent vending. So we have created a little bit of a guideline of how we should be looking at where some of these things are projecting out, which you can see I've pulled in bits of on the left-hand side. So if we look at something like, modern payment methods and how economic access is changing, where people can get things on the go and they can get that today and pay for it later. And, very modern, very flexible payment methods are starting to come in. We can also see shifts in consumer behavior where they are expecting experiences to be much more curated, so personalized to my needs in the moment. And we can also see closer inside of our category that anything that is convenient is starting to become also optionally premium and higher quality. So for example, you have vending machines now that are serving freshly made ramen. So one of the things that is coming out of that is that actually on-the-go convenient premium options that are curated to my experience are a great opportunity. And so we have made a long-term investment with smart, intelligent vending that is very interactive and creates a personalized experience. And you can see the investment of that with a partnership with Selecta in the European markets. So an exciting foray into an area that we've already had invested in, where we start to sort of directionally push our business into more of the modern areas within it. In the midterm futures, an example of how we're doing that is with feel-good snacking innovation. So here we might be seeing things around, from an external macro environmental perspective, health. People are starting to pay more attention to, making choices that are better for them. So better eating, healthier eating, trading off some of those things where they're, having a treat to making a slightly better choice. From a human perspective, we see that actually when they do that, they don't want to compromise, and they don't have to compromise. There are so many great options out there now where they can have something that's better for me, but also tastes really, really good. And that's incredibly important. And so when we look closer into our category, we see that we really double down on this. So the ability for someone to go into the chocolate aisle and get something that really delights them and surprises them, and maybe combines things like sweet and salty flavor combinations, or provides a different texture experience, is really critical. So combining all of that is better for you, a little bit healthier, no compromise on taste. We have created this M&M's Munch'ems innovation. It's a limited edition product currently in the US that's being piloted, and it's your same delicious M&Ms, but it is coated, instead of a candy shell, it's coated in a chickpea shell. It's also baked, it's also gluten-free, and I believe it's 30% less sugar. So it's slightly, better for you, / it makes you feel a little bit better about what you eat. And then in the longer term futures, we have an example here, which is fresh off the news, which is, the Kotokoa Chocolate partnership with Perfect Day. So here we've been highlighting movement towards eco-friendly diets, and people really wanting to make choices around, where is my product sourced from, and how is it more environmentally friendly or less impactful on the environment. And so inside of that human perspective, we know that people are still wanting to indulge. They still want to have a really delicious, high quality chocolate product when they deserve a reward, but they want it to be, in some cases, more meaningful. So more meaningful could mean that they're making trade-off decisions, which is what we see inside of our category. They're trading off where their purchase is made, or how it's made, or where that money is going from, based on who is making a more responsible choice in how the product is made. And so what you can see is, with planet-friendly futures and with people wanting more choices where they can make decisions that support that, a great opportunity for us with the Kotokoa Chocolate, which is, like I said, a partnership with Perfect Day. So it's an animal-free dairy chocolate, and it's made in a more sustainable way. It's designed with sustainability in mind. So you're making a choice that's not necessarily about your health, it's about your taste preferences and rewarding yourself, but also primarily about choosing something that has a lower impact on the environment. And so what's really critical when we're starting to highlight, visions like this for the future, or we're starting to help our business to invest into the future, is that we're pressure testing ourselves. So, checking our own cognitive bias. So what is familiar to me? What potentially am I recommending something that I want to see come to life is really important. And a part of the way that we do that is by partnering with our industry peers and the industry experts in Foresight. So one of the best things that you can do is, if you're interested in Foresight, futures thinking, or if you're just interested in making sure that your planning skills are more future forward, is that you connect in with the industry. And this is something that we do quite regularly at Mars Wrigley. We connect in with our peers. So we've learned a lot from PepsiCo and their Foresight teams in how they created futures thinking inside of the organization. We learn from other organizations like Disney and how they do it. Connecting in with them is relatively easy and incredibly beneficial. Obviously, there are a number, hundreds of Foresight consultancies and agencies out there that can help to pressure test and guide your thinking. We have a few partnerships with the likes of stylists where we use them consultatively to pressure test what we've come up with. Are we right? Are we missing something? Which is a really critical part of that. And also, actually looking at what other agencies are out there. Are there new agencies that are starting to use different and unique methodologies? Are they leveraging AI more? And really keeping an eye on what some of those new methodologies might be is quite critical. leveraging free resources. There are a number of companies, these resources are out there. You can watch YouTube videos with the likes of Alex Fernani. You can access free tools and methodologies from the Future Today Institute, from the Future School. If you're interested in, what is a futures radar and what is a cone of plausibility, or what is Foresight, even generating from an ROI perspective in my organization, these are all, things that are readily available online as a free resource. You can, of course, go and get formally accredited and trained and certified inside of Foresight or Future Studies. And there are a number of organizations that can do that. We leverage them quite extensively inside of our training as well. We've been trained by the Institute for the Future, but we also do connect with these industries to see how they are thinking and how they are shaping Foresight skills and tools for the future generations, and connecting in with them and having conversations. And then, of course, there are a number of communities that you can connect with. So networks, not just one-on-one, which you absolutely can do, but also organizations like Future Space, which I've just joined, a network of futurists. And there are a number of them out there where you can just have conversations with people who are practicing Foresight. So Foresight isn't just one thing. It's about really leveraging a number of different, critical thinking tools. It's about leveraging the best brains in the business and Foresight to help you to practice it better. And then it's about turning that into action for your organization. So oftentimes we say, Foresight means nothing if we don't actually act on the future, as Alexander Graham Bell said. And I will quote him endlessly. Another great thing that he said was, one door closes, another door opens. So it's important for us to be continually observing and looking for those open doors and walking through them, taking action on some of the things that we want to play out in the future. And that is it for me. I would love to take any questions. Thank you so much.
Very much, Joanna, for this very interesting presentation. And I already have two hands raised by our delegates. I'm going to bring Ida first. Ida, if you could enable your camera and your microphone, and you will be live with us right now.
Hi guys. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Joanna. Really interesting insights into Foresight. Yeah, it's really exciting, and I've really looked into how we can apply Foresight in our company. I'm from Gojek, which is ride-hailing, food delivery, and logistic company in Southeast Asia. So my question is on how was the buy-in to Foresight throughout the whole company and Mars Wrigley, and what was the did you have to do a lot to get buy-ins, and what was that journey like to actually establish Foresight in your company?
Yeah, it's a really great question, because oftentimes when we speak to people who have implemented Foresight, it's one of the things that we always talk about is like, how did you get buy-in from everybody? And not just from your leadership team, which is obviously incredibly important, but across the entire organization. So we often say it's about building a Foresight culture inside of the organization. So we spend a lot of time up front, about probably 3 to 6 months, doing roadshows. So really going out and meeting with teams, specific teams, and sharing with them, why is Foresight valuable? How can we help you? And that was a really critical part, I guess, of raising awareness about it. So I think oftentimes when people see work from Foresight and they're like, who is Foresight? What do they do? I don't understand. That's a barrier. So really just communicating to them, we are here and we are in service of you. We can help you, use us, leverage us. That was really important. The second thing that we did was right off the bat, we did a piece of work to help them to navigate through the pandemic. So it can be the pandemic, it can be inflation, it can be anything situational right now that can help to push the thinking further out for the organization or for a specific team, helping to solve a problem, making Foresight really tangible and simple and real. Can be a great way to almost give like a proof point or a point of credibility for people to really understand how it can be used in the further out future for other projects. So we found that to be a really great way to do that. And, we've had it in play now for about 2 years. So we're still on that journey. We're still continuously sort of upskilling and training and talking about Foresight and what it is alongside delivering tangible projects. So that's a continuous journey, I think, that Foresight will be on, as it's a fairly new capability inside of, particularly organizations like CPGs.
Yeah. All right. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks for the
Thank
question.
you very much. And we have one more question. Jeet. Hello, Ajit. Are you here with us?
Yes, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Joanna. It was a great presentation.
Thank you.
In terms of visually, also, I learned a lot. The question I had is, let's say, three phases of foresight that you had mentioned: explore, sense, make, and project. Now, explore. I mean, one can imagine a lot of ready-made data sources and other things are available. But when it comes to sense, make, and project, especially given that, as you rightly pointed out, it's not forecast estimation, but rather it's a foresight, I mean, for lack of another word. So how do you, let's say, quantify the directions? When I say quantify, it is not number to it, but let's say X is more likely than Y, or let's say something is very, very unlikely to happen. That kind of quantifying, just to give a direction answer. So is there some quantitative methods that you use to make that happen? Just wanted to understand that.
Yeah, a really great question also. So as much as possible, we try to feed in data and quantification sort of before we get to that point. So any kind of data that we have around consumer adoption and growth and NPD launches, or even social conversations online, like where is this trending towards? What kind of data do we have to pull into that? And then once we identify that that is something that we want to explore, there are some sort of AI quantification tools that you can make. And obviously, you would apply that to your specific category or your specific segment. However, a lot of those are sort of in flux. So what we often say is that we like to use things like maturity curves. So really helping the business to understand when the tipping point is, when something will go from niche to scale. Because that's often where Foresight kind of lives, is like in that early adopter, very early innovation phase, to help to say, this is when we think in the next 3 years, we think you should go and invest in this over here. So we use maturity curves quite a lot, and we leverage maturity curves, with a combination of quantitative sources, very, very anchored into humans. So consumption, adoption, behavioral quantification tools, and then obviously anything to do with actual market sizing and sort of a combination of all of that. And then when it comes to sort of decision making and how do you make your recommendation a little bit more quantifiable, oftentimes we use something like an impact probability matrix. So where we start to sort of be able to give a more definitive view of when something should be a higher priority for your specific segment or your specific business. So impact probability matrix is probably one of the key things that we use. And I would say that as much as possible, because, oftentimes it's said that Foresight should be qualitative, not quantitative. I think that what we find in CPG is that everything needs to be quantitative. We need to be able to show an ROI off the back of the investment. So we try to balance both of those. But we try to do that in a really tailored way. So if we're, if, for example, we're talking about plant-based chocolate, we would probably quantify that or recommend a different approach to that if we're talking to an innovation team versus a sales team that's going to go talk to a customer. So as much as possible, we try to work hand in hand with specific teams to help give them a very tailored recommendation.
Yeah, thank you very much. That makes it very clear. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Jeet. And we have one last question from the chat. It's a two-part question. So, in your opinion, how to improve our foresight thinking? And the second question, as an agency, how can we convince the companies with the foresight, and will they trust to provide data which is needed as a base for this analysis?
Ooh, I feel like that's a three-pronged question. So I'll answer the first part of that, how to improve foresight thinking. It's a really great question. So inside of Mars Wrigley, what we've done is, I'll point to two things. One is that we've tried to make futures thinking a little bit simpler for everyone in the organization. So oftentimes, if you think about Foresight, you think about trends, and you think about probably like a 50-page report or an industry report that's really intensive. So what we've done is we've created a podcast where we talk about future topics. So it's something that's really easy that people can listen to in our organization. They can start to get their head around what kind of questions would you ask if you're a futurist, and how are other people thinking about this? So really making it very conversational, very easy for the brain to process, and very easy for people to access, I think is really critical. And then the second thing is that we try to, sometimes when we deploy Foresight work, we don't just give them the end outcome, we take them through the process. So for example, if we're making a recommendation, we might say, let's look at the working document together. It's kind of like in a project where you take people through the mural board and you go, well, here's everything that we looked at over here, and this is why we're telling you to focus on this bit over here. So sometimes we do that to help to sort of build the skills in people to understand how you would do that yourself, because we want Foresight to be practiced by everybody in the organization. And then the question about agencies and how you can convince companies to leverage Foresight. I think that most companies would be would be silly not to want to be future-proofed, whether they're an agency or whether they're a private organization like Mars Wrigley. You know, a lot of companies are thinking about 12 months, they're thinking about 1 to 3 years. And so we often get very sort of stuck and wedded to what plans have been created for that 1 to 3 year future. And therefore sometimes blindsided and sometimes disrupted with things that happen that require a longer term planning. So I would say, you know, start to pull in things that are looking 5 years out, 10 years out into your organization. And you'll start to notice that those things are starting to trickle through into today anyway. So we often say in Foresight, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. Famous quote. So, you know, when people started talking about the metaverse, there were signs of the metaverse 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So how do you keep pulling in those examples so that your company starts to pay attention to them? And then ultimately you're going to give them a little bit of that ability to start planning a little bit further out. You know, obviously when it comes to credibility, trust, providing data, I would say leverage case studies. You know, if your company is a company that likes to look at other agencies and what they're doing, give them examples of how they're investing and how they're pulling in futures thinking into their organization. So I think case studies are a really great, I guess, starting point for agencies that don't currently practice Foresight.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for answering the questions and for this very interesting presentation for the end of our first day of the MRMW conference. So I want to thank you and thank all the delegates for joining us in today. Now I would like to invite you for wonderful networking, which you can find in the agenda and the link here in the chat to join us for a networking hour on the Wonder app. So please join us there. And of course, I hope to see you all tomorrow. We start at 2 p.m. Singapore time and 8 a.m. Central European time tomorrow, with topics related to AI, blockchain, metaverse, Web 3.0, but also sessions related to sustainability and the convergence of UX and market research. So I hope to see you all tomorrow, 8 a.m. Central European time and 2 p.m. Singapore time. One more time, thank you, Joanna, for joining us today, and see you all in the networking.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.